Okay, so here we are again, ready to wrap up the Great Depression material. This is just the second of the two recordings that we've got for this topic, and next we're going to go into the New Deal, which, as I said, I'm treating as, in a sense, kind of two separate topics, even though they certainly overlap and sort of mesh with each other, historically speaking. I just wanted to do the New Deal as a primary focus of a particular thing in that way, and so that's the reason that I've separated the material for the Great Depression away from the material specifically about the New Deal itself. So make sure that you're checking the full PowerPoints on Blackboard. Make sure that if you've got questions about anything that you get in touch with me so that I can help out with that. And this one shouldn't be too terribly long. We don't have a lot of slides to get through for the remainder of the Great Depression stuff, and so let's get to it. So in the previous recording, I talked about some of the sort of background for the Great Depression, why it happened, where it comes from, what sort of causes were responsible for coming together in a very particular way at a very particular time to result in the Depression. So today what we're going to talk about is some of the consequences, right? What's actually happening as a result of the Great Depression. And one of the most significant things is the almost entire collapse of the American banking financial system. Lots of banks had been sort of overextending themselves with bad loans, especially loans that were used to buy stocks on margin, which, if you remember, that's if you don't have enough money to pay for a stock up front, and in total you can pay for a portion of that stock, and then hope that as the value of that stock increases over time, when you sell it, you're going to be able to potentially be able to make up the money that you owe to pay off the stock going forward. So it's definitely not, today you can still buy on margin, but the margins are slightly different. In the 1920s, in some cases, you were able to buy on margins as low as 10%. And so as these banks really sort of reach the limit of these margin calls that can't be paid back, a number of them fail. And in the first 2.5 years or so of the Great Depression, from about 1929 to about 1932 or so, 5,000 banks around the country collapse. Some of these are large, some of these are small, some of these are medium-sized. It really doesn't matter. It is a widespread kind of almost catastrophe in the American banking system. And this contributes also to that problem of lack of purchasing power. It contributes also to the issues that will sort of further this downward spiral in the economy as a whole. Because as people lose their savings, it means that there's less purchasing power. It means that they don't have money that they can then rely on to pay for new items, new materials, new services, which then means that people that provide those materials or provide those services aren't getting paid, which then ends up meaning that they get fired, they get laid off, they don't have enough money to pay for other services and products, and so it continues that downward spiral. It gets so bad that by the time Franklin Roosevelt is inaugurated, in 1933, that it is $140 billion worth of money essentially evaporates from the American economy. And typically, if you multiply 1920s and 30s money by about 10, that'll give you a rough equivalency to what it would be today. And so that means you're talking about more than $1 trillion, almost $1.5 trillion dollars just gone from the American economy. In one case in particular, the Bank of the United States in New York City collapses in December of 1930, and in this one bank failure alone, 400,000 people lose their entire life savings, lose their accounts. So not all of the failures are quite that dramatic, but certainly all told, it is going to be a really significant part of the Great Depression. In addition, unemployment is roughly 25%, which when you take that across the entire country, 1 out of every 4 people does not have a job, which, you know, the flip side of that is 3 people out of every 4 are still working. The problem with that statistic, though, is even the people who are working are often working at either reduced rates, reduced wages, or for reduced hours. And so underemployment is also a tremendous drain on the economy as a whole at the time as well. Some areas, in particular industrial or manufacturing centers, like places in Ohio or around the Great Lakes in the Midwest, get hit even worse, to the point that places like Toledo suffer unemployment of 80%. So it's just a devastating kind of experience for people living through the Great Depression. And people are traveling around the country in the hopes that they can find jobs and work elsewhere, which is really often sort of futile, and the odds of that are pretty low. The images here are actually really interesting because these are hobo signs that were sort of invented during the 1930s by people who were traveling around the country, whether they were on railroads or whether they were hitchhiking or whether they were walking, trying to get from point to point, trying to find jobs in different places. And because they had this kind of underground, almost hieroglyphic system, they could indicate from one person to another what kinds of situations somebody might experience or expect in a particular neighborhood, on a particular street, at a particular house, in a particular town, whatever the case may be. And so this is just to give you a sense of the way that people moving around the country at the time would sort of communicate with each other, even in times when they weren't necessarily face to face, to give everybody a sense of what kind of circumstances they were walking into. And so the Great Depression certainly is one of Hoover's most significant crises or difficulties that he faces. Towards the end of his administration, towards the end of his years in office, he's also faced with a very specific kind of an event that, if anything, helps to undermine his likely chances of re-election even further, right? By that point, there wasn't a great chance that he was going to win re-election to the presidency, but it was feasible, I guess. But in the summer of 1932, there is this demonstration, this protest in Washington, D.C., where tens of thousands of World War I veterans travel to the Capitol to demand immediate payment for the bonuses that they were owed for their service during World War I. And these bonuses could potentially have been up to $625. So it was a substantial amount of money. The problem, though, is the federal government in the 1920s and 1930s had been really kind of fixated on the idea of a balanced budget. And especially the congressional Republicans were emphasizing this, as was Herbert Hoover. And so while these bonuses were due to be paid in 1945, they weren't ready to be paid, they weren't in the budget to be paid prior to 1945. So veterans were saying, we need this money now, we are owed this money anyhow, you may as well just go ahead and pay it to us now, rather than waiting 10, 12 years, when who knows if we would even survive that long, right? Conditions are bad enough now that we need the money now, and we really can't wait. And Hoover and congressional leaders refuse. They say, nope, we can't do this, it's not in the budget. Most of the people then leave, but about 10,000 of them end up staying, and they put up sort of a shanty town, a tent village, near the Capitol building, and some of the pictures there sort of show where this is. Hoover is concerned that this is bad optics, right? It doesn't look good for his administration. He also worries that these are 10,000 people who are unemployed, who could potentially be disruptive or get unruly, cause problems for the city, cause problems for his administration. The Washington, D.C. Police Department aren't able to disperse the people that are living in these tents and these shacks. And Hoover then asks the commander of the U.S. Army garrison near Washington, D.C., if he will intervene. His name's Douglas MacArthur. And MacArthur really kind of goes overboard. He uses excessive force, really, to try to expel these demonstrators, expel these squatters, basically. And several people die. The shanty town catches fire. All of this is well publicized. It's well photographed. The American public reads about it in their newspapers. The American public can see images of all of this happening in newsreels, which are sort of little short news segments that would be run before motion pictures in theaters. And if anything, this really puts sort of the final nail in the coffin of Hoover's chances of re-election. It was going to be an uphill battle, to be sure, for him because of the Great Depression itself. But the consequences then of the way the bonus army, as it was known, the way the bonus army was treated, ends up being sort of the last thing in Hoover's sort of to kill off his chances at re-election. One of the other things that is affecting the country, it's kind of a perfect storm of awfulness during the early years of the Great Depression. One of the other things that affects the country is a drought, a massive, almost biblical scale drought called the Dust Bowl. And this is a photograph of the Dust Bowl during the 1930s. This one was taken in Oklahoma. And the Dust Bowl is a result of over-farming. We tend to think of the Great Plains as being very fertile and very productive and all that. It really isn't, right? We can fertilize it, we can irrigate it to make it productive, but naturally speaking, the Great Plains are extremely dry, and there's not much topsoil available for farming. And if that topsoil gets overused, if it gets sort of depleted or dries out because of a lack of water, that can be catastrophic. And that's really what happens with the Dust Bowl. There is a combination of poor climate conditions, a pretty significant drought that affects most of the center part of the country. At the same time, farmers are over-farming the land to try to produce more and more and more crops. Taken together then, the soil dries up and begins to blow away. And we have these huge dust storms. The lower picture there is one of them that can be hundreds of feet high, can be miles and miles and miles long, and can last for days at a time. Some of these are so bad that dust from these windstorms from places like Kansas or Oklahoma or Texas, dust from there can make its way all the way to places like London, in fact. So massive, massive dust storms. People are forced to leave their farms. People are forced to leave their homes. The people that stay in their farms, stay in their homes, end up suffering from a variety of different illnesses, especially respiratory illnesses, things like emphysema, what we would call today COPD, tuberculosis, cancer, all kinds of really serious problems. the people that do migrate, the people that do try to find better opportunities other places, oftentimes migrate west, and oftentimes they migrate towards California. In some cases, there are some better opportunities for them. California isn't hit with the same kind of climate conditions, and it is a farming economy at the time in many ways. But it cannot absorb the tens of thousands of people that are moving there. And in some cases, there's some kind of unscrupulous business activity that essentially lies to try to bring people to different farms or to different sort of occupations, just so that they can exploit the need that these people have by, you know, offering them less money because now they don't have a choice, right? They can't go back home. They don't have anywhere else to go. Maybe they've lost all of their possessions in the move. And so it ends up being yet another challenge, another problem that the country faces in the midst of this ongoing economic crisis. Now the farm sector, the agricultural sector, is also not only an economic crisis, but in many ways a crisis of productivity, a crisis of lifestyle, and an ecological catastrophe that is on par with some of the worst ecological sort of crises that the country and even the world has ever faced. So lots of things going on during the period of the Great Depression. That's going to be the end of this particular section. The next thing that we're going to get into then will be the actual New Deal, talking about President Roosevelt's ideas for how to counteract some of the negatives of the Great Depression, whether it's unemployment, whether it is regulating the banking industry or the stock market or that kind of thing. Really, in many ways, profoundly changing the nature of the government's relationship to the American population, the relationship of the government to the economy as a whole. So a really, really significant period in American history. So that's where we're going to go next. I hope you're all doing well. Let me know if you've got questions, and I'll be sure to get to those and get you some clarity for things that you might be confused about or not too sure of. And I will talk to everybody soon.